Hello, my name is Roseanne Soto, and I am presenting this visual essay presentation on my final project for the Gender in East Asia course, which focuses on Japanese women in the workforce. Um, my thesis is, from the post-war period to modern day, women in Japan have increased freedoms and liberties such as universal suffrage in 1947 and 1986's Equal Employment Act. However, looking into the timeline events since then might give insight into how, although women's rights have advanced, offering them opportunities in having successful career roles, they're still very much influenced by traditional, conservative, patriarchal society and stay within traditional gender roles. The focus of this presentation is to highlight women's roles in the decades following World War II and how Japanese women were most affected by the changes in new political, social, and economic circumstances at the time. So I titled this A Timeline of Paradox because one of the scholarly articles that I've read referred to Japanese women as a paradox, and we see that here. As the article said, that it's interesting to see how Japanese women are both described as modern yet traditional, Western yet still keeping East Asian cultural roots, such as previously studied in this course, Confucianism. They are both dynamic and yet static, so motivated to make change and yet static, as in stuck in their position where there's not so much social mobility. And they are also career women and housewives. But I want to present this project that shows that the stereotypes of today, which combine many of these factors, do not describe the experience of Japanese women since World War II. They have drastically evolved in their positions, in their roles, and their gender roles as well. And so I say here, it is important to understand how Japan recovered from the war and adapted to a new, transformed country that it is today. This has an impact on the lives of Japanese women, men and women, whose experiences during this post-war time period are different, diverse, and not all related to traditional gender roles. And to summarize a bit of the circumstances following World War II, I thought this quote from the Atlantic newspaper really summed it up. After Japan surrendered in 1945, ending World War II, Allied forces led by the United States occupied the nation, bringing drastic changes. Japan was disarmed, its empire dissolved, its form of government changed to a democracy, and its economy and education system reorganized and rebuilt. Years of reconstruction were required to recover from thousands of air raids, including the atomic bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. By the 1950s, a former enemy became a Western ally. Parts of American culture became part of the Japanese landscape, and Japan began to find its economic footing as a manufacturer of consumer devices and electronics. So it's quite interesting that so many things happen in this era, and that's why I call this slide Eras of Change. But the question is now, through so much change, how does this affect Japanese women? And so we get some more into the background, which does focus on the US occupation a lot. So, to talk a little bit about the economic upward mobility and how Japan is known for its electronics and manufacturing companies today, I do have some information on how black markets were very popular around the time because there was a lack of resources, scarcity. Many people were starving of malnutrition and lack of food. So, although the US helped establish centers of resource distribution, black markets were on the rise. And so many electronics companies, for example, they found used parts that American soldiers didn't need, but they could still use, and they adapted them and transformed them into like more advanced technologies that were marketable to the US later on. And so here we see everyday life, how there was more interaction between Japanese and American soldiers at the time. even though it was interesting to learn about their trauma, how they moved forward, moved past thinking of Americans as their enemies, and ended up even some of them marrying them and immigrating to the U.S., becoming Japanese war brides. They saw marriage to Americans as an opportunity to start anew, since many of them couldn't imagine reliving their lives in their bomb cities or suffering even more further. But meanwhile, many women helped rebuild their cities and move forward, such as the women here in Hiroshima. So yes, we see this summarizes a little bit of the 1950s, and I'll explain more into the 60s. But since I won't be focusing much on the 1970s and 80s and 90s, I thought the slide would highlight some of the evolution over time up into the 2000s, and how these previous events in history have affected the women in the workforce, which also is connected to the birth rate exceeding the death rate, so sort of population decline as the country gets older, but are not reproducing as fast to make up for lost jobs. And so we'll continue on and delve into the 60s of this era of political participation. So the 60s were a very political time, starting off with the Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security between the US and Japan. Signed by Prime Minister Nobusuke Kishi, it was met with massive protests known as the Anpo movement, as Japanese people believed that it was an unequal treaty that gave the US more power over Japan. Many women participated in these protests, practicing their political participation, but they also practiced political participation through peace movements in large numbers in response to an incident that occurred in 1954 regarding the radioactive fallout on a Japanese fishing vessel near a US hydrogen bomb testing site in the Pacific. So here we see women marching alongside men, opposing war for the sake of their children. Housewives who lived through the devastation of World War II build grassroots initiatives and contributed to Japan's largest anti-nuclear movement. So I thought this was really inspiring, because previously, during the war, we would probably see Japanese women as housewives whose duty to the nation was to reproduce, just to have children, or to take care of their families while their brothers, husbands, fathers were away and fighting for the emperor. And this brings out a whole other side of them due to the ending of the war. And this brings us to economic opportunities. So this is quite a lot of detailed bullet points, but I do want to highlight this lifetime employment standard. There's a whole mine protest, labor union situation, a whole national crisis on top of political protests. But essentially, the main point is gradually, Japan's major industries adopted a policy, a so-called lifetime employment. And this job security brought labor peace for Japan's largest companies. So the idea is that you're employed at a company for life, and you're set for life. So there's no need for you to leave, just stay a couple years and then leave, go to another company. No. This is the era where economically Japan is doing so well that salarymen become to exist, and this later affects the work experience of women, Japanese women. And I do want to highlight the differences between housewives and career women, and how salarymen and men who are CEOs affect women in the workforce, which is my ending conclusion. So about 7 or so slides of content, and I hope I'll I'll clarify a lot of my more important points um, later on. Thank you.